Once you have found the European Tinderbox Part 1, please download the notes document. Use your Kami extension shortcut to open a Kami tab. Drag and drop. You should not be prompted to open it, so this should be a new notes document for us. So as we've seen, this period is the roughly 3 decades, 1914 to 1945. It is bookended by the start of World War I and the conclusion of World War II. And as these images suggest, the breaking of globalization came with a lot of violence. We have the destroyed no man's land of Flanders in Western Europe, the mushroom cloud of the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan to end World War II. That this is still part of our look at globalization, and the same objectives are relevant, but in somewhat different ways. And one of the ways to understand the stages of globalization is to also understand how it is punctuated at times by a retreat. The world becomes less globalized, or in some cases, globalization breaks down. We also understand the factors that enable globalization, again, by knowing how it has retreated or broken down in the past. Right? For a lot of us, we have only learned how our cars work when they break down. When they're working, we don't think about spark plugs and fuel injectors and pistons and compression rings and journals and crankshafts, any of that until they go wrong. And that's when we learn about what made our car work in the first place. And also, as one of our objectives that will be highlighted here, in terms of thinking about how to predict the future of globalization, well, sometimes knowing what's going to happen is also aided by knowing how globalization has grown, and again, how it has fallen apart or broken down. And as a little bit of a spoiler to this, as we'll see, one of the things, especially since the beginning of the 20th century, that has made globalization go forward or retreat or break down has been the attitudes of leaders in the United States. And so that's something that will be a recurring theme from here on out. Now, you've seen some of this and already seen it in more detail. I want to kind of give you the condensed version now that you have some of the context for this to make sense. We know that Globalization 1.0 ended due to the outbreak of World War I in August 1914. Globalization is not going to really recover until after the end of World War II in 1945. 1945 is getting ahead of ourselves. We need to understand World War I first. And you've already learned that the spark that set off World War I was an assassination. An assassination that, if it had not been real and if it had not been ultimately successful, would have looked like a Three Stooges comedy sketch. But it was successful. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed, and his death matters because he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when we say he was the heir, that means he was supposed to be the guy who would be in charge of Austria-Hungary next. And when Franz Joseph died, he was supposed to take over. All right. The analogy for the start of World War II or World War I is a cliche, but like a lot of cliches, it's cliche for a reason, because at least at one point it made a lot of sense and was a good analogy for talking about something. And so here's the analogy. the assassination of the Archduke was the spark that set the European tinderbox on fire with World War I. Now, this was a way of thinking about it that at one time had made a lot of sense. When it was first trotted out, there were people who understood what a tinderbox was, and they kind of understood using one to start a fire. So the first image you have up in the very top right of this slide has a few things in it. One, we've got the tinderbox, and within that tinderbox is some flammable material. Some char cloth, and some other stuff, and a rock. A piece of flint, and then this kind of ornate-looking thing there is a steel flint striker. It's an old-fashioned version of, if you have some family members who smoke, of a cigarette lighter. Right? Same principle as a bic. Right? You've got a steel, and you have a flint. Those flints are usually actually made out of magnesium. This would be an actual rock. Right? You strike the steel against the rock, down onto the tinder from your tinderbox. You get an ember that grows and glows, and you use that to start the rest of the fire. It's the source of this analogy. So what was it that made Europe so combustible, so susceptible to suffering a major war? Okay, and this is where we're going to revisit some of those conditions that you saw in more detail. You'll see in a bit less detail now. To recap, 1, imperial competition. The Austro-Hungarians, the Russians, and the Ottomans. Right? Today's Turks. Right? The Ottomans had large contiguous empires. These are land empires, because contiguous means that they're basically single masses of territory, like the 48 contiguous United States. That's what that means. All 48 of those states are linked together on a single landmass. Hawaii and Alaska are separated to us, either by an ocean or by another country. The Brits and the French, their empires were different. They were overseas empires that were spread out all around the globe, including also in the Americas. Right? The British and the French had their own little slices of territory around South America. And of course, the Brits boasted an empire so large the sun never set on it. Even small countries. Now, Portugal had once been a big deal, and so kind of had the Netherlands in its own way. But even Belgium and Netherlands and Portugal, which by this time were really minor powers in Europe, had pretty substantial overseas empires. Germany, which had become very powerful in a short time. Remember, it's not a country until 1871. But in that 3 decades to 1900, it becomes very powerful economically and militarily. But it was feeling kind of an identity crisis. Here it was, this tremendously powerful state in the continent of Europe, but you wouldn't have known it by looking at the size of its empire, right? Because its overseas empire was tiny by comparison. And this meant that Germany felt slighted, felt like it was getting a raw end of the deal, and this kind of left it with a chip on its shoulder or a grudge against its other imperial rivals in Europe. We will illustrate kind of the situation here with our land empires, our major colonial powers, our smaller states, and Germany with this map. Now, they've done some things that didn't entirely make this easy. They recycled some colors that were pretty similar, but we've got Germany here in orange, and this is German, and this is German. This actually belongs to Portugal. And so does this. So little tiny Portugal. The Netherlands and Belgium we can barely see on this map, but this belongs to Belgium. Remember King Leopold and this belongs to the Dutch. Again, it's not that Germany's empire is small, and you also had, I almost left out German West Africa, mostly what's now Cameroon. Germany's empire isn't small, but relative to its power, they think it should be bigger. Second factor is that we've got opposing alliances, right? Opposing military alliances in your notes. In the decades leading up to World War I, especially the last decade leading up to World War I, European powers had divided into two armed camps, two main military alliances. One is the Triple Entente, known previously as the Entente Cordiale, and that is represented in green. Russians, French, and Great Britain. Opposing them, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Italy. Now you see Bosnia on there. At that point, Bosnia is part of this. And this alliance structure left the Germans feeling encircled. Now, it's not that Austria and Italy are somehow less encircled. They just are kind of less anxious about it. Germany, then and later, is kind of obsessed by the fear of having enemies on two sides and being faced with a two-front war. Now, don't take that as making them particularly paranoid. The United States military, its major plans are also based on the notion that it needs to be prepared for a two-front war, one in Europe and one in Asia, and it needs to be able to fight those simultaneously. So this is not some kind of unique paranoia of the Germans. Third factor, buildups in arms and arms races. And again, in the years preceding the war, most European armies grew immense and very quickly. This is important because historically, prior to this period, armies had been small. There were some rare exceptions of some temporarily large armies, but they mostly just can't exist. And the reason for this is that armies are incredibly expensive. But two things have happened. One, globalization 1.0 has made European states a lot wealthier. It has also, as we've seen, helped their populations grow. And when you have more people and more money, you can have larger armies. There are more people able to serve, and there's more money to pay their salaries. Navies also get a lot bigger. Again, this is down to money. European states get wealthier. The wealthiest ones build big navies. And it's kind of symbolized by this cartoon from the magazine Puck in 1909. And as you see, I mean, lots of countries are involved. The United States has a very small army, but is building a navy in this period of time. We want to be like the Brits. The Brits are in it, right? Japan is in it, but as we'll see, Germany and Japan are the two main participants, right? And their rivalry with one another is the most important. I've skipped over something here, and that's industrial innovations. Remember, one of the things that happens is they're able to develop bigger and better battleships as they not only invent new weapons, but industries that are capable of producing those larger and larger, more powerful ships. So that naval arms race, again, is critical. Okay, so one of the things, battleships become larger and there are more of them. This graph, of course, covers more than the time period we're interested in. We want to stop right here. Design displacement is about how heavy a battleship is, right? It's how many tons of water it displaces when you put it in water. And they grow by nearly 50% between 1905, when these naval arms races really get going, and the start of the war. And we also have, again, more and more of these ships as we move along. Right? They're getting bigger, and there are more of them. This particularly lets us see the growing numbers. Right? The United Kingdom has 30 of these dreadnoughts, the word for this particular big class of battleship. The Germans have 19. Right? Everybody else is pretty far behind. And fourth, railway schedules. Right? This would seem like the thing where we're playing a game where, hey, Brody, which of these things does not fit with the others? And Brody's like, yeah, it's railway schedules, dummy. Right? I mean, that's obvious, Dr. Brown. You're an idiot. One thing, Brody wouldn't actually say that, at least not in person because he's respectful. But railway schedules really were important. Right? You saw this in the video, right? But they're not just putting it in there to be weird. Steam-driven trains, the rail networks they run on really are modern marvels. They're still modern marvels. We don't use steam engines. We use diesel, electric, and purely electric trains. But trains and rail networks are still amazing. And they were, we've lost an F, but I think it's in your notes, essential to the fighting of the First World War because they moved millions of troops over thousands of miles. And they could move troops quickly from one part of the war to another as needed. They also moved countless supplies and weapons. You saw that there were over 1 billion artillery shells used in World War II. Those moved by rail. For the most, those are too heavy to move any other way. But the problem is, when you've got things that are based on rail, where you have complicated things like rail yards, track switches. If you change any part of a schedule, you delay a train on one part of a rail network, what you can end up causing are cascading chain reactions of delays for other trains on the network and traffic that gets snarled and it's hard to move and get the rail network flowing again. And what this meant for World War I was that when European armies began to mobilize, and mobilize means you call up the troops, right? You call up, as you saw in a lot of cases, reservists, who are people that are trained to fight but aren't actively on duty and being, living at a fort, being paid a salary. When you call all of those people up, you get them into uniform, you get them their rifle issued, their kit, them assigned to their units, you start prepping artillery, all of those things to move. And then you get them rolling towards the enemy borders. It's virtually impossible to stop. That's precisely what we saw with Tsar Nicholas. He wanted to slow things down to consider the Kaiser's peace officers. The Kaiser had said, look, if we stay neutral, will you stay out of this? Just leave it between Austria and Serbia. And the Tsar thought, that sounds like a tempting offer, but he couldn't stop the mobilization. And part of it is the video suggests to you that Russia had the superior rail network. And they did. They had thousands more miles than anybody else. But remember, they're also far and away the largest country, then and now. They're huge. Their rail network really wasn't sufficient. Right? And they were much slower to mobilize anyway, and the Tsar knew, right, if he slowed things down on this rickety, undersized network, And he was going to be at a huge disadvantage if Germany changed its mind and decided that it was going to go to war. So he just couldn't halt. He kept mobilization going, and World War I gets started. When we add all of that up, you've got a Europe that's divided up into opposed armed camps, both of whom, and in terms of the states, all of whom are growing their armies and their navies. And you've got all of these weapons sitting around, and you've got a motive to use them. There's rivalries between particularly Britain and Germany, but also Austro-Hungary and Russia, for example. And these rivalries and grudges provide a motive for somebody to start using all of those weapons. You have alliances that make sure that once a war gets started between two of those, and I've misspelled two, don't tell your ELA teachers, their allies are going to get pulled into those fights. If that also sounds crazy that these alliances would automatically bring in other states, that's the basis for NATO, right? Article 5 in NATO is the idea that if Claire is a NATO country and Angelina is a NATO country and so is Malia, if Jaden throws something at Malia, then Angelina and Claire look, well, Malia's just been attacked, we invoke Article 5, and we automatically, everybody goes to war against Jaden. So, it's same principle now as back then. This, of course, makes the war larger automatically. But we've also got those empires to throw into the mix. And those empires will take something that is a European war and make it a global one. You will see this. If you ever have the chance to go to London and the Imperial War Museum and see the displays of the Imperial forces of Britain in World War I, you're going to see uniforms as diverse as kilts from Scotland, along with the uniforms of troops from southern India. And it's all going to be there. In Africa, you had German and African troops fighting against Portuguese recruited African troops, white South Africans, people from Pakistan, India, all of them thrown into a mix, fighting across jungles and savannas. It just global in ways that are kind of hard for us to comprehend without seeing it. And so the sum of this equation is World War I. No wonder people called it the Great War and the war to end all wars. It was hard to imagine that there'd ever be anything to top it. One other way that may be helpful for you to think of it is what's shown in this cartoon. The situation kind of derisively known as a Mexican standoff, right? And somebody's going to get hurt, right? Eventually one of these people is going to make a move. That's another way of thinking about the start of World War I. Next two images will help. So this first one kind of shows the chain reaction. Right? The little guy is Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Prussia, France, and Britain. It's a cartoon, but it's really not a bad description of how things went. And the second map shows how the alliances and the empires end up overlapping. You've got triple alliance empires and triple entente empires. And they're spread out. Britain's Canada to Australia, France, Africa, what's now Vietnam and Laos, and all of that together. Now, at this point, considering those different causes, I would perfectly understand if you had any one of these reactions, and maybe all of them to some degree. One, this is stupid. Right? No war is inevitable, and the war could have been stopped. And that is one criticism of how historians and political scientists talk about World War I. They call it overdetermined. Right? You can come up with so many reasons that it started that it sounds like it's impossible for it not to have started. And so you could say, well, that can't be right, because nothing's inevitable, and you're right. The issue here is that the conditions simply made it such that the odds of stopping a war once any kind of conflict started became much smaller. So it's not inevitable, but it's easy for people to make it look that way. You could also quite reasonably think that these Europeans were stupid to make such a mess that was ready to turn into a world war. You're not entirely wrong. They definitely, even if we don't want to use words like stupid, right, there were miscalculations and clearly mistakes and blunders made by the European leaders. All right. But don't be too quick to imagine them like the Three Stooges with guns. We'll get back to that in a little bit. You could also wonder if I'm trying to say that the railway schedules made World War I an accident. Again, no. It was not inevitable, and it was not truly an accident, but things spiraled out of control and led to war, partly because those leaders did not seem to realize just how much the rail schedules had left them in a situation where once they started getting ready for war, it was really hard to pull back from the brink. I mean, Tsar Nicholas did realize what had happened, but too late. And Germany, the Kaiser seems not to have realized that if he was going to approach the Tsar with a peace deal, he needed to have done that sooner, right, because of the importance of rail schedules. All right. Now, and also, before we begin this next part, I do want to go on record. I hate the saying, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Hate that. For one thing, I was told that a ton of times in history classes as a middle and high school student. I've had people come into school, and when they hear me, like that I'm a social studies teacher, like, oh, yeah, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I hate that. The main reason I hate that is if you think that by studying history you can somehow learn just permanent lessons, you're wrong. Right? People who have learned from history and thought, well, we won't make that mistake again, just end up making brand new mistakes that then somebody else will recycle. So my point here is not for you to somehow digest and internalize that saying. With that point said, world leaders have drawn some useful lessons from World War I. And particularly from things like those train schedules. And one example of this, it's going to take us a while to get to the example of evidence that we actually have learned something. But some of those lessons have been applied to the potential for nuclear weapons to accidentally lead to a really horrific and perhaps life-ending, and I mean like all of human life, all life on this planet ending war. So, background for this. We don't have nuclear weapons until the end of World War II. The U.S. invented them first. And these are the most destructive type of weapon that we know. We weren't the only country to end up with them, and after World War II, there was a nuclear arms race. It was mostly between our country and the Soviet Union during the period from 1945 to 1989 we call the Cold War. We call it the Cold War because the U.S. and Soviet Union essentially never went to war directly with one another during that time period. They just prepared for it a lot. The U.S. and Soviets are not the only countries involved in this game. The number of nuclear-armed states has grown from 1, when it was just the United States, to now there are 9 nuclear powers, and that number could, in some case, potentially go up quite a bit again in a relatively short period of time. Japan, for example, could develop nuclear weapons very quickly. Saudi Arabia is rich enough that it might be able to buy them, say, from Pakistan. More nukes, plus a greater number of countries possessing nukes, equals more chance that we have our own accident. Right? That there is a miscalculation or a mistake that ends up leading to a nuclear war that nobody really wanted or meant to start. All right, and if your eyes have been drawn to the images, this one really is fake. That image, though, is video from an actual nuclear weapons test in the United States. Believe it or not, the people in charge of our country used to think that it was a pretty good idea to test these things out in the open air. It's the reason that my parents drank radioactive contaminated milk as kids, because it got everywhere and into everything. All right. And if you're wondering, as the clock keeps ticking, no, there's no exit slip before lunch. We're just going to keep chugging away at this. All right. Increases in nuclear arms are known as proliferation, and there are 2 types of proliferation. The first is called vertical proliferation. That is when a single state makes more nuclear weapons for itself. That's what the U.S. and the Soviet Union did. They just kept building more and more nukes for themselves. The other kind is horizontal proliferation, where the number of countries with nuclear weapons spreads, right? It grows. Right? So states that didn't have them get them. Okay. Now, what you are going to start with on the next slide is recording some information about both types of proliferation. Have a good afternoon. You are going to use this website to provide this information. Let's go ahead and open that link. Add a full screen on that. All right. What you have here, and you can go with just set it to cumulative. You'll be able to select individual countries and slide the scale from 1945 to 2017, figure out when they first had nukes, how many they've got at different points over time. So you'll be able to move from U.S. to Russia, and you can unclick. That way it's easier to find. So you're highlighting along, and you can find out, you hit that magical year when United Kingdom gets one, and keep following it. But you'll use this information to answer these questions about vertical and horizontal proliferation since 1945. In some ways, you'll see that there's now less proliferation than there used to be, and at the same time, there's more proliferation of other types. All right, you can start working on that now. This will be due at the end of seminar, and I know it looks like a lot of things, but guys, it's all in that one graph with that one little slider and your option to choose countries. You'll get through it pretty quick. If you have trouble, let me know and I will be happy to help you. All right, any questions? All right, don't turn in your notes yet until you've completed that. And again, turn that in by the end of seminar. I'll let you get to it.